that disruption has been going on for the last 15 or 17 years. And the root of the problem is cost and complexity. There's not many organizations in this world that can throw enough money and resources at the problem.
Everyone, this is Saeed Gordon with DOF Creations, and this is, again, our Service-Driven University series. We have Austin Hawthorne with Nile Networks here, and today we're going to discuss some of the ways that a managed network solution is helping higher ed to combat challenges around staffing, connectivity within their dorm rooms, and helping them to provide a better quality of connectivity and internet for their students and for their learning environment. So Austin, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Saeed. Hey, folks, my name's Austin Hawthorne. I run pre-sales here for Nile Secure. Been in the industry for about 27 years, former CCIE, mainly been on the pre-sale side of the house for multiple different startup vendors, most recently Aruba Networks, focused mainly on network security, and cybersecurity in the industry.
All right. Well, Austin, I know the term managed network or network management is not a new term. I know when we work together, when we talk to folks about Nile and the way that you guys do things, either they haven't heard or they have maybe an idea based on something that they've experienced from someone else. So one of the questions I wanted you to go into kind of before we go into how Nile has been helping higher ed, what has network management been? What are some of the common complaints or challenges that you've heard or seen from customers that have maybe gone into what Nile is doing, how Nile is trying to do it differently?
So, Saeed, it's a great question. And while we're bringing up the slide here, just to kind of visualize this, I think one of the trends that we've seen in the industry is that a lot of organizations are looking for areas of their IT footprint to get rid of the cost of complexity that's traditionally associated with, things like storage compute, and how, organizations have shifted to the cloud native models like IaaS and PaaS that are coming from Amazon, GCP, Azure, and the like. And the same thing as, same shift has happened with applications where, they moved away from the cost complexity of building their own applications like AD infrastructures and the like, and instead consuming that via SaaS type model. That disruption has been going on for the last 15 or 17 years. And the root of the problem is cost complexity. There's not many organizations in this world that can throw enough money and resources at the problem. Right? And if I were sitting here talking to you about data center networks or applications like AD and the like, 15, 17 years ago, this argument was already had, and the industry, the market, our customers have told us what's been proven out and what's won. And that is that the complexity is just way too much for anybody to consume and to extract the value of to match anywhere near the amount of investment they're making in it. And it's having a negative impact on the organization. So if that trend is true, which I fundamentally believe it is, and I think the market's already proven that with IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, then we have to believe that most organizations are looking for other areas in their IT stack that they can have the same type of outcomes. Where else can I get rid of that cost complexity? Where else is that cost complexity causing me problems? And one place that fundamentally has not been disrupted is the network stack. And if you think about the network stack, and there's a slide here just talking about, the different pieces and parts to this, I as the customer or as a traditional vendor have to put together a solution made up of disparate pieces and parts, different Wi-Fi systems, wireless systems, wired systems, different distribution systems, different visibility solutions, different network access control, DHCP, DNS, network management, config management, all these different pieces and parts. And then I've got to bolt solutions around it to try to deal with the complexity, which in and of itself is just more cost complexity. And it's fundamentally broken. And when coming back to your question about managed services, there's been models that have been in place, or solutions or offerings that have been in place for the last 2 or 3 decades that this problem has existed, where I can move the complexity fundamentally from me to somebody else. That doesn't solve the cost of complexity. All I did was move it, right? And if I personally, as an organization, have a challenge extracting the value out of all this investment that I'm making because of the complexity, then how is anybody else going to do it really any better? Right? It might be masked from me, but is the outcome of the network actually delivering better results to me just because I move the complexity from here over to here? If you think about a traditional managed service, provider, or an outsourcing company, which, by the way, Saeed, this four-letter acronym, which is Network as a Service, has been defined multiple different ways to cater to whatever the solution is of the provider or vendor that's trying to capture this market opportunity, right? It could be a packaging exercise of all this stuff that you see on the screen, wrapped up with some traditional services and, put into a lease to turn into a monthly payment. That's not as a service. That doesn't drive outcomes. It's still the same complexity. We have other providers that are basically calling their outsourcing that's been around for 3+ decades and calling that network as a service. Again, all I did was move the complexity from here to here. If you ask a managed service provider, hey, can you ensure that my network is always going to have the coverage, capacity, availability, performance that my users and devices and my business need, and it's always going to have the security and the capability, and it's going to be free of issues, known issues, especially bugs and the like that. Nobody's going to be able to deliver that, because ultimately dealing with this problem that's on the screen turns every customer environment into a snowflake, which means it's a different run book, which means I can't touch it and I can't let anybody touch it. Otherwise, it's going to fall apart. They are very reactive in nature to, hey, when something breaks in this complexity, I'll go ahead and patch it for something that might have been fixed 2 years ago, but I'm not going to do it until that time, right? And they might be able to give you an uptime SLA, but just because an AP or a switch has been up and running for 10 years straight, that does not necessarily equate to what is the performance and capability it's providing to the users and devices that are using the network, and thus the business. This stack, because of the complexity, is fundamentally not agile, and it can't keep pace with the business needs at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And when you talk about agility or that term agile, when I first started, I started in the DevOps space. So everybody's always trying to be agile. Everybody's always trying to, utilize this term or say how close they are to it or how they're moving towards agile. But when you look at it, agile is basically saying, let's start clean, let's keep clean. And if something does pop up, because we've been relatively clean going forward or from day one, it makes it easier for us to get clean if something ever pops up. But I think that's kind of the challenge, and I guess that's kind of the beauty of Nile. And I'm sure you'll talk about how Nile's done it different, but I guess that's the uniqueness of Nile, is that Nile is trying its best to start clean. And by starting clean, that gives you a much more straightforward path to maintaining that agility by maintaining that cleanliness in that back end of how you're supporting it and what everything's built on. I guess that's a correct way, or hopefully it's a correct way to frame it.
Yeah, Saeed, that's exactly the way to frame it. And, if you think about it, I'll give you an analogy. I like, talking about, what our customers say when I talk to customers, because they're ultimately the ones that are dealing with this challenge. I was talking to a very large healthcare organization. I'm here on the West Coast in San Francisco, and it's a healthcare organization that's based out of here. And when we were talking to them, they're still going through this, but they're in a state where not a single IT project can get funded unless automation is a part of it. And by the way, that sounds fair. That sounds like a good approach. But let's break that apart for a second, based on what you just said. If my environment is not clean, if my environment is full of that complexity that I showed on that last slide, right, and any little change in that environment could cause a change in the success of my automation outcomes, then there's a problem, right? And if I think about it, for me to go try to solve these problems with automation, I've got to go hire somebody that knows automation or teach somebody automation. I've got to go buy a solution like Ansible. I've got to come up with the problems that I'm trying to solve. I got to figure out what the data structure looks like and the telemetry coming from all these different solutions and feed it into a common data lake. And then I've got to write some automation to find the needle inside the stack of needles that'll pinpoint that this is a problem and then write an action against that. That's all the work that has to be done day one. Then day two, somebody's got to maintain that. Somebody's got to troubleshoot it. Somebody's got to support it. Somebody's got to add to it. And if any of those things in that last slide change, that troubleshooting is going to be problematic. It's basically, in my words, adding more cost complexity on top of cost complexity and trying to, again, extract the value that somehow aligns to the investment that I'm putting in. To your point, we have to start clean, right? We have to start with more of a deterministic environment instead of all these different snowflakes that are riddled with all this different complexity. Going back to my Amazon example, if you think about what Amazon has done with like an EC2 instance, their IaaS solution, they basically purpose-built a storage and compute stack to deliver predictable outcomes to customer at scale.
Mm-hmm.
It's got all the capabilities that a customer needs. It's got all the performance and the scale and the security and the outcomes that customers expect, but they purpose-built the stack underneath the covers. They don't let customers go in and config the stack. They don't let customers go in and necessarily choose the protocols or the capabilities or the vendor that builds that stack. It's just, here is your storage compute, and I'm going to start from a clean slate and purpose build it so I can deliver those outcomes at scale. But I'm going to give you, the customer, the control you need to be able to do what you want to with this storage compute, because it's your storage compute. I don't own the application, you own the application. It's your business, right? And I give you the visibility you need to be able to support that workload that's running on top of my storage compute.
Mm-hmm.
That shared responsibility model, or that hybrid model, it's what's great about as a service. They built something from the ground up. They didn't take servers and appliances off the shelf or top of rack networking off the shelf from vendor XYZ. They built a purpose-built stack that is deterministic in nature, to use your words, that clean slate, to be able to deliver those predictable outcomes. That's what we've built from a Nile perspective, right? If we can start with, hey, let's first get rid of the snowflakes, right? I'll give you another analogy. I like analogies. I think it helps paint a picture. But I'm a network engineer by trade. I know how my brain works, and it's a mess. If you got in there, it's very confusing and frustrating. But it's the way engineers' brains work. But if I had a room of network engineers, including myself, 100 different network engineers, and I gave them a homework assignment, saying, "Hey, design me a network for this new building, and it's got to satisfy these 10 use cases. Some of them are telephony, some of them are applications, some of them are security, some of them are performance, whatever those use cases are, common use cases that our customers deal with every day." But I said, you have to fit it into this budget envelope, which is a finite budget envelope because you can't afford everything. And I need you to make it simple enough to hand it off to operations so operations can support it. I guarantee you, I would get at least 100 different designs out of that room. I know personally, I would put together 5 or 10 different ones, with a bunch of pros and cons associated with trying to fit something into that budget envelope, and a bunch of trade-offs and compromises associated with that, as well as what simplicity versus what complexity can we actually operationalize. It's just the way my mind thinks. It's the way network engineering team thinks. But if it was all based on the same set of use cases, then why does it have to be different? Why does it have to be this architecture versus this architecture versus this architecture? Why does it have to be this protocol versus this protocol versus this protocol, right? If I can satisfy the use cases, if I can bring the sophistication of all that, but make it simple by eliminating the cost, because there is no CapEx in a true as a service model, right? Which means there's no upfront investment. And I can eliminate the operational burden by fundamentally eliminating complexity. Then can I deliver a sophisticated network stack to you, right? That gives you what you need, and it can keep pace with your business. The only way to do that is to take those lessons learned from the cloud and build something from the ground up that is natively, that is cloud native, vertically integrated from the cloud all the way down to the on-prem APs and switches, et cetera, to be able to deliver that innovation to you at scale.
So when we talk about, when we hear the term scale used, I know for some of the customers that we have, when they hear the term scale, I think it makes them concerned a bit, because scale seems the goal of scale is efficiency, but there are some times where I don't necessarily want a solution to be efficient. I want it to be I want there to be kind of patience built in to navigate or take your time through certain challenges. So how do you create performance that leverages or takes advantage of scale while also being able to have the support to the customer that is patient enough to help them through challenges that you really can't do efficiently? You have to take your time with them.
Yeah, it's a great question, and part of this takes those cloud principles, Saeed, again, brings them to networking. If we think about like your Office 365 account, you have the ability, I have the ability to opt into that early developer release. What you and I are doing when we do that, we are becoming the beta testers for that cloud model. I don't know if you've ever heard of, or your audience ever heard of, A/B testing or canary testing, right? But that model is cloud native. That model mitigates risk. That model makes sure things are baked before we roll it out everywhere. That model ensures that there's some level of maturity to the approach, right? And we've taken that same model to, delivering these outcomes at speed and scale. Right, that's number one. And what I mean by that is let's innovate in the cloud first. Let's implement a microprocesses type architecture, on the APs and switches so we can update control plane stuff without there being a hit. Let's do this canary testing to make sure that we roll it out small number of customers first, then a larger number, then the rest of the community. And we're doing things like pre and post snapshots to make sure that these changes take effect the right way and the network post the upgrade looks like the network or is behaving like the network pre the upgrade, but with the extra enhancements, and clients that should be connecting are still being connected and security still working the same way. All of that automation is built into this to enable some level of speed. And the reason that speed's important and the way we do it is important is there's another concept out there that I think is important that a lot of our customers suffer with, and that's called the consumption gap. Consumption gap is, if you remember that slide that we first showed with all of those different software versions, hardware versions, et cetera, there's a bunch of features, capabilities, best practices, tuning, everything else behind the scenes for each one of those elements. And those vendors, to compete in the marketplace, they're releasing innovation and new capabilities quickly. And it's not just new capabilities to enhance security, maybe some to enhance performance, maybe some to enhance interoperability from new devices, maybe it's some to enable new business use cases, but some of it, Saeed, is actually bug fixes too, right? And I can't tell you how many customer environments that I've been in where, they put this level of investment in, but they're X number of major versions behind, X number, Y number of minor revisions behind, Z number of patch revisions behind, and they're not able to actually consume all of that innovation because of time, resources, budget, expertise. Because a lot of the focus in these organizations should be on the strategic business initiatives that matter, like in schools, enabling the classroom of the future and helping staff with e-learning applications and ensuring that there's a great student, experience, or whatever the initiative, or securing the environment to lower risk and lower cyber insurance premiums. All of these should be strategic things that I'm focused on. But if I'm stuck trying to do bug scrubs, trying to do patches to make sure my network is not, encountering a bug that was fixed 2 years ago, or I don't have the latest interoperability enhancement to enable interoperability with the new iPhone, or deal with how Intel chipsets deal with 11R or whatever it might be, then my network is suffering and I'm spending too much time trying to keep the lights on instead of focusing on the things that matter, right? This consumption gap problem, we need to fundamentally fix. And if you think back at cloud and what I was talking about with IaaS, you don't worry about that anymore, right? The network's always capable of meeting the pace of your business. The network is always optimized, or in our world it's the network, but in the Amazon world it's storage compute. But it's always optimized based on what we've learned, not just in your environment, but across environments, to make sure that your network is taking advantage of fixes, optimization, enhancements, et cetera, that are applicable in your world that we've learned across the install base, right? That balance of speed to ensure that you're getting the value out of the network that you need to make sure it's keeping up with your business needs and it's problem-free, and the mature process innovated in the cloud that we've just adopted here, that's what's critical.
There's a point that you mentioned just now about giving an organization the time back to focus on security. And when we work, I'll bring in K-12 into this, which is slightly different than the higher ed space, but education is bombarded by different types of attacks, especially the phishing identity attacks. And when you're talking about the type of effort and time that's required to manage your alerts that are coming in, that's one of the big things, dealing with alert fatigue. And just trying to make sure that you're staying on people to do your phishing trainings, or to ensure that you're scrubbing for, unused credentials that maybe somebody has credentials that have been out there and left unmonitored and are now being exploited and stuff. All of that takes time, all of that takes people. And if you're able to kind of take a little bit of work off of someone's plate and allow them to focus on another area that's just as important, that can kind of have like a 2-for-1 special type of impact on, the workload and the work that someone's doing for their team. I guess from your perspective, how does a more reliable network help to improve security overall? When you talk about that management component, obviously the bug fixes can kind of come from the perspective of keeping it clean. But what are some of the ways that if we're trying to just day by day improve how we're doing, say, network management, which is the focus here, what is the type of impact that can have on security, understanding that security or cybersecurity is probably the most critical technology concern for almost every organization?
Yeah, this is a big topic, Saeed. So let me break that apart a little bit, because I think part of it is the network infrastructure itself. Part of it is the network security we enable. Part of it is, the visibility and, and the interaction or the integration with the other tools to overall reduce risk in an organization, right?
Mm.
It's one thing to go chase down all these issues, but can we fundamentally reduce the amount of risk so there's not as many things that we have to chase? And the things
Mhm.
that we have to chase, the blast radius of that is as small as possible.
Mhm.
But let's start, simple, Saeed. One, we kind of talked about how we roll out patches and roll out vulnerability fixes, et cetera, at scale, right? People
Mhm.
shouldn't have to worry about, hey, I've got to patch up my, my infrastructure of 1,000 switches and 2,000 APs, and how long is that going to take, and can I take it on, and how big is the risk, and is it worth it or not worth it, and can I do it in a day, or is it going to take me the whole summer, and how does that increase my risk? That's a challenge, right? In today's world with all these different disparate systems. That should just happen behind the scenes, right? So that
Mhm.
issue fundamentally goes away. Number two is, if you think about, and I'm sure a lot of your customers or the audience, especially in higher ed and K through 12, a lot of these folks are budget strapped. A lot of these folks tend to want to get the maximum life out of the investment or the hardware that they're purchasing. What that typically leads to is stuff going end of life, end of sale, end of development, which means
Mhm.
I can't get vulnerability fixes for. I can't get patches for anymore, right? And if I can't get patches for, I now have a risk that's there that I've got to try to accommodate some other way. I might be saving cost over here, but it's going to hit me somewhere else, right? And we've seen, the trend of cyber insurance premiums go up and down, but as of like a year and a half ago or so, I heard from universities that those premiums were going up 100% to 400% year over year
Mhm.
if you could get coverage, because the list of requirements went up from one page of loosely written requirements about 5 or so years ago to 40 pages of very detailed requirements lately, right?
Mhm.
So if I can't patch my systems, guess what? That's a risk. My premium goes up. And it's just like, okay, am I really saving money in this organization? And I'm also exposing risk in my organization.
Yeah.
We had a couple of customers that, one thing they love about an as a service type model is there is no end of life. There is no refresh cycle, right? Amazon doesn't tell you when they end of life a server, right? It just goes away and there's a new server there and it's transparent to you, and the end of life problem goes away,
Mhm.
right? And that even goes with new capabilities, right? So that's number two. Number three is kind of what I'm alluding to on this slide, Saeed, and that's the security that is built into the network itself. If you think about networks today, and by the way, I think fundamentally that securing a network is the poster child of complexity that
Mhm.
we've been talking about so far on this call. I've done it for a long time, and it's very, very complex. And for that reason, a lot of folks trade off that complexity with risk. How many environments are you still walking into where the wired port is wide open? It's mapped to a VLAN. I can plug in anywhere, and I'm going to get some type of access,
Mhm.
right? The reason for that is pure complexity and cost, right? And the other reason for that is because a lot of security is bolt on and you have to configure it. A switch that you take out of box, there's no security inherently, turned on. You have to first go configure security on that console port to try to lock down config access to that box. Then you got to try to figure out how to go lock down the wired ports to handle all the different types of users and devices that are going to connect to that with multiple different types of authentication schemes. Do the same for wireless. Then you got to figure out your segmentation strategy and figure out what VLANs you're going to use. And then you got to figure out where am I going to trunk those VLANs to what firewall? What kind of policies am I going to build on the firewall? And is it going to be zone-based, subnet-based, user ID-based? And how do those integrations work? And then most organizations take a stance of assume compromise, Saeed, because you can't prevent everything, which means now I've got to figure out where am I going to tap and what detection tools am I going to put in there to try to find attacker behaviors, hopefully early enough in the kill chain, way before it becomes a breach. That's the complexity story of trying to lock down the network. Right? Again, there's a lot of trade-offs and compromises that go, inside of that in most organizations. But what if you could just consume security? What if you didn't have to bolt it on? What if the network was already inherently insecure and frankly more secure than you could ever make it? Right? If you could consume security without worrying about the complexity and the cost of it, and it was just turned on, and it enhanced your existing security tools like your firewall and your other detection tools, that could dramatically lower your risk in your organization, which could dramatically reduce the insurance premiums, and coming back to your original question, dramatically reduce the amount of time and effort it takes for the security teams to go chase down stuff. And what I mean by that, just at a very high level, we basically implemented something called Campus Zero Trust, right? And this is what I mean by consuming security. We took zero trust principles and built it into the campus network, which is not a paradigm that exists in any networking vendor today. We basically said, hey, everything's got to be end-to-end encrypted by default. Everything's got to, we can't allow any unauthorized connections, and we have to enforce every request or every flow. Those are some core zero trust principles. The network stack comes up and does that by default. It essentially becomes an extension of your firewall. What if every host was isolated from every other host by default, and the firewall had the ability to see every flow from every host and then had the ability to detect behaviors in it that were malicious and prevent those flows from even happening? Like the first thing that a compromised host is going to do when it comes into a network, it's going to figure out where else can I laterally spread. So it's going to do a host scan, a port scan, figure out what other hosts on my VLAN I can actually spread to establish persistence elsewhere. Guess what? Nature of switching, normal switching, all of that stuff will happen at the access switch with inside the VLAN. The firewall, your security tools don't see any of it. That means the blast radius becomes bigger than it needs to be, which makes the efforts of the security teams that you were talking about earlier that much greater to figure out where all has this spread and how do I clean this up. But if I can segment, take a data center concept and basically isolate every host from every other host on the network, I truly have a capability to reduce the compromise of a breach down to 1, or reduce the blast radius down to 1. Does that make sense?
It does. And the blast radius is such a big thing for us. We talk about with our customers, defense in depth, and trying to make sure that whatever the impact is of a potential cyber event, keeping it as small as possible. I think it seems like part of what you're talking about and what I hear you talk about is that there are going to be challenges that nobody's going to be able to get rid of, but it's our goal to make sure that whatever we cannot fix, at the very least, we minimize the impact as much as we can. Is that fair?
That is absolutely fair. That's absolutely fair. And, there's no one size fits all in this, right? I think, being able to consume security the way that customers need to consume security today, you need to provide flexibility, right? There's different concepts that are out there. I will tell you that we have some very large financial organizations that are frankly leading the charge on disrupting the status quo of on-prem networking. And I see campuses in higher ed moving the same way, in a sense of, if you think about, again, looking at trends in the industry have shown this cloud native approach, this cloud adoption, which means my data, my critical assets, the stuff I'm trying to protect, has moved from on-prem into the cloud. And security controls have moved along with it, right? You've got CASB and SASE and ZTNA and all these other solutions protecting access to those assets, to that data in the cloud. And you've got endpoint agents protecting the data and the assets that are on the laptop or the endpoints. If the security controls have moved over here, Do I need that much security controls on the network? Or are they redundant in a sense? Right? And I mean, when I say that, I mean like identity-based security controls, saying that, hey, this authenticating this is Saeed on the network, and he needs to be segmented this way, and this type of policy, and everything else. Or do those other security controls actually just give you that? And that means on the network, all I really need, beyond guaranteed performance and scalability, is I need some level of isolation to make sure that Saeed's laptop can't talk to Austin's laptop, doing port scans and host scans and all this other stuff, just so I can minimize the blast radius. Because the rest of the control to the critical assets is happening elsewhere, right? So security could be dramatically simplified, but again, even doing that host-based isolation is incredibly complex in a traditional network. So I have to be able to consume it as opposed to bolt it on.
Yeah. Okay. Since we've already started talking about the campus and some of the things that you've seen on the campus environments in higher ed, I know there are quite a few testimonials that have come from higher ed, but what is the one you're most proud of, or what's the impact made by Nile that you've been most proud of?
It's a great question. And, it comes down to I think the pain or the problem statements that we're trying to solve, Saeed.
Mhm.
And, ultimately what's at the root of all of this is there's just not enough budget, not enough people, not enough expertise. And I think higher ed, a lot of higher institutions have a hard time finding and retaining talent and have a hard time putting as much budget into this as they need to, right?
Mhm.
And that has an impact in a lot of places, right? It has an impact on the security side, like we've just been talking about. It has an impact in, frankly, keeping students on campus, right? A lot of higher ed, they make money from students staying in dorms, right? And eating the food on campus, and all that other stuff. But if the networking's not great there and there's other options outside of campus, that's a lost revenue stream,
Yeah.
right? And all the other strategic initiatives that we kind of talked about, because too many people are chasing things on the network, just trying to keep the lights on because it's too complex and it's been neglected, right? So if we think about where we've had the biggest impact, it's freeing up those budgets and those resources to go focus on the things that matter, right? And the
Mhm.
way we fundamentally have done that, many of our customers, I'm not going to say every single one, but many of our customers have realized fundamentally 100% reduction in network-related tickets, right? If I'm doing my job well, and I go back to that Amazon example like I keep on referencing, does a customer have to respond to or know about any infrastructure-related tickets to those Amazon data centers? The answer is no, right? So what if that same paradigm existed on the network side? What if
Mhm.
100% of actual network-related tickets was gone? How much time would that free up? And what could the resources do with that time? And what type of impact could it make to the organization if that was the case? That's number one. And number two, if the users have a better experience because there's no issues, then what would that do for dorm retention rates, right? Maybe even attracting students because it's a better network, it's a world-class network, this anything, as well as what the staff and faculty can do on that network. And that goes beyond just that piece. It's not just eliminating that, but it's even giving visibility beyond the network. I think we all know that the network gets blamed for everything when it might not be the network, right? But if I can solve the network issues themselves, but then give proactive visibility into where there might be an issue instead of waiting for a user to report an issue, and that could be in network services side, that could mean in the internet connectivity outbound, that could mean in the applications themselves. What if I could give proactive visibility into those issues, which further reduces the number of tickets and the mean time to detection and resolution of those tickets, which means everybody's happy, users are happy, students, staff, faculty, because they can do more with less problems, and IT's happy because they can go focus on the things that matter.
Mhm. Yeah, that's well, I mean, I think anybody listening to this that hasn't worked with Nile yet would probably say that's a dream. I think that's always, that comes up quite a bit. That's where, especially when we talk to our customers and someone wants to kind of test drive and see if it's true, always the proof of concepts to give you the opportunity to see if it's real or not. Um, but so some of the stuff that I know that came up, just like you mentioned, the dorms as a revenue center for schools. Have you seen any colleges that have been able to show, we have more activity in the dorms, or at least the dorm experience has improved based on what students are saying or what they're seeing?
100%. We make it a point, Saeed, to do some pre and post surveys with the students,
Okay.
Before these things go in, not just in the dorms, but across campus. And
Hmm.
100% it's night and day. It's been consistent night and day every single time. And I want to point out something, Saeed, because I think there's a matter of pride here that I want to be careful that, we're not um, negatively kind of, or putting any kind of negatives out of the efforts of anybody that's in your audience that are putting into, their networks today.
Hmm.
Frankly, it's not that anybody's doing a bad job or a poor job, right? But dealing with all this complexity, not getting the budgets you need, not getting the resources you need, not getting the time you need, right? Frankly, nobody can keep up with it. Nobody can keep up with it. Um, you know, I do a lot of these presentations, so forgive me if I repeat some analogies, but we had a very large social networking company in the offices here for an EBC about a year and a half ago.
Hmm.
Household name within 3 guesses, you'll be able to guess the name, right?
Hmm.
But as you can imagine, somebody like that has a lot of budget, has a big staff with a lot of expertise that they're throwing at this problem. It was about a 4 or 5 hour EBC. And about hour 3, I asked the question of this team, and it was the whole network engineering team, all the way up to the senior director of the team. We asked the question, how often are you guys getting pulled into escalations for network related issues? Saeed, they literally looked at each other. They laughed, giggled a little bit because they knew that it was more than it should be, right?
Hmm.
And the senior director looked at me and said, Austin, my team, every single one of them, gets pulled into network related issues, escalations, anywhere between 30% of their day to 90% of their day.
Jeez.
If an organization like that is struggling with this complexity, what hope does anybody else have?
Hmm.
Right. So I implore like the audience that's listening to this that this is not a shot at your capability. I'd have a hard time dealing with this complexity, right? I have had a hard time dealing with this complexity. This is more a statement about the industry, right? This industrial complex, if you want to call it that, that nobody can keep up with. You're just buried in the complexity, you're mired in complexity, you're stuck in the complexity. But I don't know of anybody that loves doing bug scrub, Saeed, but wouldn't it be great to get out of that world,
Yeah.
right? And focus on the things that matter to the organization, like cloud networking, like data analytics, like AI, like cybersecurity, whatever it might be, and use the network as a tool as opposed to a burden.
Is there, at least in the educational space, is there any, I guess, maybe negative impact that comes from all of the different types of application they have to support? Because it's education focused, it's technology focused, there's security, there's HR and payroll, there's any number of resources that have to be supported, and they all have slightly different needs or requirements to make sure they're working at their best.
No issues that we've seen yet. And
Okay.
one of the things that, I'll kind of unravel, I think, the root of the question that you're asking, Saeed, because I think some of your audience will probably be thinking, what you were actually kind of going at there. And that's, have we oversimplified this? And does simplicity lead to lack of capability? I will tell
Mm.
you it's actually the other way around. Sophistication does not have to equal complexity. If I can deliver sophisticated capabilities to deal with all these applications, use cases, etc. But without all of the complexity, that's really what the challenge is. That's really what the opportunity is. That's frankly what cloud has done, right? And when you talked about at the beginning of this call about starting with a clean slate, it's all about how can I deliver the capabilities you need with literally without all the complexity.
Mm. All right. Well, I guess I think when we talked about the cybersecurity concerns from greater support around networking, is there a benchmark, a milestone, or a long-term goal that Nile has for its customers from a security perspective, as far as, you can see the reduction in network troubleshooting tickets? What is maybe the goal or the milestone from a security perspective of maybe a reduction in the number of breaches or the ability to reduce the impact of a breach Are there any milestones or metrics that you guys are looking to have over the next, year, 3 years, what have you?
Yeah, in combination with the security players that are out there, like the firewall vendors, like Palo Alto and those types of folks, as well as the cloud, security players, the SASE folks, the ZTNA folks like Zscaler and Prisma, Cloudflare, Netscope, those folks. I think there's a couple of metrics, Saeed. One is, reduction in cost, reduction in risk, and reduction in reducing the amount of time to detect a compromise, right? If for the security-minded folks that are on the call, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the kill chain, and those types of things. A lot of security controls are all about how do we detect something before it becomes a breach, knowing that the blast radius is going to likely be bigger than we want it to be, right? And it relates to the number of infected hosts and everything. But how can we literally reduce that compromise down to a blast radius of 1? Right, which reduces costs, reduces the challenges that this brings to an organization, especially if you think about something like ransomware. If I can detect something sooner in a kill chain, right, that makes everything more effective. And going back to the reduced cost piece of it, listen, I'm not a CISSP, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I know a little bit about this world. But it's always cybersecurity is an interesting beast because it's always a measure of how much risk do I have in my organization? What are the tools or the capabilities that are out there to reduce risk, and how much risk does each one of them reduce? And then you compare that against the cost of that mitigation technique, and whether or not the cost of that mitigation offsets enough risk and the cost of breach, to justify the investment into that tool. That's the whole game with cybersecurity, because I can't afford everything and I can't stop everything, right? So if we can deliver a network architecture that can optimize your firewalls, your cloud security tools, your XDR or NDR type platforms, or your SIMs, right? Maybe I can actually, reduce cost elsewhere because the inherent security built into here offsets more risk than some of those other tools.
Right? Okay. Are you able to, I know you have I think it's University of Missouri at Kansas City is one of the named higher eds that works with Nile. Are there any others that you're able to, mention, like, we've helped with this challenge or helped them to address this issue? I think Stanford is one that got announced a little while ago.
Yeah, there's a number of universities. We're doing really well in universities, and we're seeing a big uptick in them adopting this type of model, mainly because of the pain that exists in those environments, because of the budget constraints, as well as the resource constraints, and the needs of the university. And frankly, Saeed, universities have the noisiest user population in the world, right? In the sense that there's always complaints about the network. There's always complaints about connectivity. So you combine those all together, and there's a big desire to break the mold, right, and have something that just solves these underlying problems. So you mentioned Stanford. We are in a computer science building there. Stanford's an interesting one. One of the things that Stanford finally got tired of was chasing around bugs, chasing around config mistakes, constantly. Their team of 4 was spending easily 25 to 30% of their time, and these weren't network folks. These were folks that do everything, right? But they're spending 25 to 30% of their time just on networking related tasks, troubleshooting. The straw that broke the camel back, I won't name the vendor, but they wound up stuck on TAC calls for 3 months, dealing with an issue that fundamentally at the end of the day wound up being a config issue. They went through multiple layers of tech, trying to explain how their network was built, send config, send logs, try to replicate the issue, gets escalated to multiple levels of attack, wash, rinse, repeat, do that for 3 months. And then finally they get to a person that says, oh, if you put this one command line in, the problem will go away. Come on, like how are we still dealing with that type of world? That was the proverbial straw, right? With that problem goes away. Any bug fixes, optimizations, etc., get automatically applied. There literally is no underlay config. There is no golden config. There is no CLI, because that brings these types of problems.
Yeah.
University of Missouri, Kansas City, we've got 3 buildings over there right now. Same kind of issues, right? As it relates to student challenges or issues with the network, too many issues with the network chasing it around. There was a budget constraints, have you. JCSU, Johnson C. Smith University, we've got the whole campus there. I think it's 27 or 30 buildings. We've got University of Denver, both their mountain campus as well as a number of student dorms that are on campus, and we're rolling out aggressively throughout the rest of the campus now. University of Arts in Philadelphia, that's a little liberal arts college, about 1,500 students, 10 building in downtown Philly. They lost their network engineer. They were, the guy left, right? They were about to lose their director of infrastructure through retirement. They had literally, I think it was like 6,000 wired ports of switches across their buildings, might have been even more of that, of end of life equipment because they couldn't afford to refresh it. They had 2 or 3 generation old wireless that was deployed in a sparse coverage model. They couldn't afford, to upgrade. They still, when we got involved with them about 2 years ago, they still had a wired first strategy, and they were still running cables every day to new devices, right? They're the ones that where I was kind of referencing, Saeed, where downtown Philly, there's plenty of opportunity or options for students to go live in an apartment and get better internet, right?
Yeah.
And there, by the way, the other thing that I didn't really touch on that I think is a university trend, hopefully it's not too pervasive, but I've seen it all too often, is enrollment has been ticking down year over year. University of Arts, it was ticking down year over year for the last 5 years when we got engaged with them. But guess what? Their IT spend stayed the same. So, if you think about it as a service, one of the constructs of it or one of the outcomes of it is my spend should align to my quote unquote business performance. If I'm using less because I have less people using the network, why is my spend stay the same, right? And why am I dealing with all of these issues? And that exists at a number of different universities, that we've worked with and talked to. So yeah, just to give you a few, you can see a couple of other names that are on the screen here.
Okay. And I see also, I think Winston-Salem State as well.
We're in the dorm. We're in a dorm over there.
Okay. And it seems like that dorm environment is where a lot of the colleges are either focusing or maybe taking that first leap. And like you said, I mean, that's the loudest or noisiest constituency. So if you can find a way to make that group happy, it's probably easier to show the value across the campus and across the university landscape.
Yeah, I don't know if we're crazy, Saeed, but we typically tell our customers, give us the worst place and we'll prove it.
Yeah. Well, we have a few folks that are doing the same thing with you and us right now, so we'll keep plugging away in that regard. But I appreciate you walking us through kind of what networking has traditionally been, and from a management perspective, some of the ways that you guys are trying to adjust that or take that in a new direction, and also particularly within the education or the higher ed space, how some of those changes can create a right now as well as a long-term benefit or impact. So we really appreciate you being with us, Austin. We appreciate you giving us the opportunity to learn a little more about Nile. But we also want to say thank you to our customers that are watching this and individuals that will watch this. If you have more questions for myself or for Austin, you'll be able to reach us through the Service Driven University community, be able to reach out to us directly through our information available there. And please let us know if there's anything else that we can provide you as far as information, updates. Also, you can go to Nile, I believe it's nilesecure.com, correct?
Yep.
And learn more there. So again, for Saeed and for Austin here, this is Service Driven University hosted by DOF Creations, and we appreciate your time today. Thank you.